Hey mama, welcome back to the channel for another video. Today we're going to be talking about fatigue in mums and what are the most common causes that I see in my practice. Fatigue and exhaustion is by far the most common concern that mothers come to see me for in my clinic. Fatigue has been kind of normalized in new motherhood, like it's normal to be tired, you're a mum. But I disagree. It is not normal to feel exhausted, fatigued, burnt out, even in the context of early motherhood. All too often, I see this fatigue blamed solely on sleep deprivation. This completely dismisses any chance of taking a holistic look at a mother's health and well-being. Now, don't get me wrong, sleep deprivation is no joke, and it's a huge contributor to feeling exhausted or feeling fatigued as a new mum. But even in sleep-deprived mums, it's not uncommon for me to see one of these other factors that I'm going to discuss today at play as well, which adds unnecessarily to their load, to their fatigue and exhaustion. So that brings us to factor number one, and we've already sort of touched on it. It's sleep deprivation. No meaningful discussion about maternal fatigue can be had without discussing the impacts of sleep. Having your sleep broken night after night is inevitably going to make you feel less rested and less energized. But of course, as every mother knows, it's not as simple as just getting more sleep, since baby sleep is something that's largely outside of our control, particularly if you have a wakeful baby or a baby with low sleep needs. But there are some factors that can be at play here, things like food or environmental allergies, food sensitivities or intolerances, nutrient deficiencies, low muscle tone, sleeping disorders, and other things. So it's important to get an assessment of your baby if they are waking quite frequently. I recommend talking to somebody who has qualifications in child sleep, infant sleep, and child development. Now, whether you choose to try and modify your baby's sleep patterns or just go with the flow is going to be a decision that's totally up to you as the parent. And it's going to be influenced by things like your values, your family situation, the degree of social support that you have, your tolerance for sleep deprivation, your own temperament. So many factors. So that's a decision that's entirely up to you. The second cause is non-restorative sleep. Non-restorative sleep is distinct from sleep deprivation itself. It's when the sleep that you are getting is not as restorative as it could be. It's not of the highest quality. And when we say quality, we're referring to going through sufficient amount of sleep cycles and dropping in down to all the sleep states so that we can allow our body to rest and repair and restore overnight. Basically, we're trying to make the sleep that you are getting, if you're having broken sleep, or whether you're not, whether you're getting a full night's sleep, this can still happen, but we want that sleep to be the best possible sleep we can get. It can be tricky to tease apart what's sleep deprivation and what is non-restorative sleep, particularly if you are still waking throughout the night. But, we're going to look at things like, are you falling asleep easily? Are you staying asleep or able to fall back asleep after you've had a waking with your baby? Maybe you're waking feeling unrefreshed or needing to take a nap during the day or feeling excessively sleepy during the day. Maybe you're having energy crashes in the afternoon. These are all things like within the bigger picture of your health that would think about in terms of your sleep quality or the restorativeness of your sleep. Sleep quality is regulated by a variety of factors, mostly to do with our nervous system and our neurotransmitters, and some hormones are at play there too, things like melatonin. And these in turn are influenced by things like our light exposure, temperature in our ambient environment, consumption of stimulants like caffeine, nutrient deficiencies, and blood sugar regulation. There are a whole host of things that we would need to look at to assess whether your sleep quality might be being impacted. You may have heard the term sleep hygiene, and that's referring to putting in place lifestyle and diet factors and environmental factors that promote and support good quality sleep. So that's what we'd really be looking at here if non-restorative sleep was an issue. The next common cause of fatigue in new mums is thyroid imbalances. In postpartum, the thyroid goes through really big shifts recalibrating itself to try and find its new normal after pregnancy, where it's been under a lot of pressure and a lot of demand to keep up with growing a baby. When we give birth, the thyroid tries to swing itself back to a normal place. And sometimes for some mums, that can end up swinging in the wrong direction, and we can end up with an overfunctioning thyroid or an underfunctioning. In fact, in postpartum, we see a real uptick in thyroid disorders, namely postpartum thyroiditis, and that usually presents as an overactive thyroid that ends up becoming an underactive thyroid over a period of a few months. Usually with postpartum thyroiditis, there are antibodies present, so we're looking at more of an immune system regulated thyroid imbalance, an autoimmune thyroid imbalance, and any thyroid imbalance, overactive, underactive, or autoimmune driven, fatigue is a common symptom there. Postpartum thyroiditis is usually seen within the first 12 months after birth, so that first year, but thyroid imbalances are often seen in mums past that first year. And they can be triggered by things like sleep deprivation, chronic stress, poor gut health, nutrient deficiencies, food allergies, and more. Other symptoms that might include the thyroid is involved in your fatigue include things like cold hands and feet, or an intolerance or sensitivity to cold, hair loss, but you do have to remember that some postpartum hair loss is normal, so really need to assess that well. But a beyond postpartum hair loss, excessive hair loss, that can be the thyroid too. Brittle nails and dry skin, changes in our bowel motions, or upset digestion, irregular menstrual cycles, although again in postpartum we might not have our menstrual cycle return, so we just have to assess that. We might have low appetite or sluggish digestion, low mood, anxiety, or mood swings, among other signs and symptoms. To assess your thyroid, we can do this through a blood test, but we need multiple markers, sometimes called a full thyroid panel. If you talk to your doctor about assessing your thyroid, they'll usually just order one marker called TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a hormone that comes at the brain level and sends a signal down to the thyroid, which sits here. We cannot assess full thyroid function without assessing the thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. TSH alone is not enough to make that assessment. So when you talk to your doctor, you can ask to have your full thyroid panel done. You may have to pay for it yourself, but it's a worthwhile investment if you feel like you have a lot of those signs and symptoms. Number 4 is chronic stress. Our stress response, which involves our adrenal glands and our nervous system, is an essential part of our physiology. It's essential for our survival, but it can be hijacked into a negative chronic pattern when we're subject to unrelenting stress. Now, stress is a term that's used pretty loosely out there, but what does it actually mean? Stress is something that happens in the body. It's a process that happens in the body, and it's in response to a stressor, which is any factor that the body perceives to be a threat in some way, and it needs to respond with its fight or flight or freeze mode. Stressors can come in many forms. They can be psychological or emotional, so that perceived mental stress that we might have from having a wakeful baby, having a baby with a highly sensitive temperament, from family factors, financial factors, relationship factors. All of those would fall under psychological stress. And there's environmental stress. So the environment that we live in or that we find ourselves in, the health of our home, are we being exposed to chemicals, the quality of our air, the food we eat. They might be physiological, so processes within the body, biochemical processes, perhaps things that have got out of balance, things like chronic inflammation, digestive imbalances, thyroid disorders, and many more. Stresses can also be dietary or lifestyle related. So the foods that we are or are not eating, that can be a stressor, as well as lifestyle factors like over-exercising, under-exercising, exposure to heat, exposure to cold. These can all be stresses on the body. And as I said, stress is not a bad thing. We want to have a stress response to these various factors. It's protective in some ways, but it's when it's ongoing without much of a break that it becomes an issue. One might argue that early motherhood is an inherently stressful time of life. And yeah, I might agree with you. You probably have broken sleep to some extent for at least a period of time. You're recovering from birth and pregnancy, which take a huge physical toll on the body. Then there's, of course, the emotional and psychological pressures and demands that come with becoming a mother. We're learning how to mother. We're learning about what we're like as a mother, different parenting styles, how to be in relationship with our baby, maybe managing the challenges of our baby's unique temperament or their sleep. All of these factors can potentially be stresses in the body. There are various ways of trying to assess our stress levels in terms of testing, including things like a morning blood cortisol, DHEA levels, or a 24-hour saliva cortisol test. All of these have strengths and limitations. It can be difficult to really assess our stress levels in the body. Sometimes we can do that without testing. And we're also going to want to consider important nutrients that support the stress response so we can remain resilient. Things like our magnesium levels, our potassium and sodium levels, as well as our vitamin C. The next common cause, number 5, is blood sugar imbalance. Now, this is a huge one and something that I'm constantly doing with the mums that I work with. When we're talking about blood sugar regulation, we mean our blood glucose. Our blood sugar levels are usually tightly regulated to allow for constant supply of glucose to our cells for energy. Some cells in the body, for example, red blood cells, will only function with the use of glucose. So they need it from the blood. But we want this to sit in a narrow range. We don't want it to go too high or we don't want it to go too low. In fact, both of those states can contribute to stress in the body. The body perceives high blood glucose and low blood glucose to be an immediate, essential stress that needs to be addressed right away. What happens when we have high blood glucose levels is that our pancreas will release a hormone called insulin, and insulin tells the cells all around the body to take up some of that glucose, which helps to clear it out of the blood. But when our blood glucose levels are too high chronically, day after day, or at various points throughout the day, we start to develop a resistance to the insulin signaling. It's a bit like the boy who cried wolf tale. When insulin comes around with its message so often, the cells start to kind of ignore it and pay no attention to it. They become resistant to it. This deprives our cells of glucose, which is needed to produce energy, which is why it can contribute to fatigue. Something else that can often happen is a process called reactive hypoglycemia, which is part of this blood sugar dysregulation. That's when we get a rapid drop in our blood sugar in response to a really big spike. So if we eat something really rich in carbohydrates, something sugary or something really starchy, especially if it's not paired with a protein or a fat or a fiber to really help buffer that blood glucose response, we get a really big spike and then a really big drop. It's that classic what goes up must come down. And so when we come down on the other side of that roller coaster, that spike, we get hypoglycemic, or our blood sugar levels can get too low. And in that situation, we can also feel really fatigued, crashing out after eating, energy slumps, and brain fog. These can all be related to that drop after the blood sugar spike. Blood sugar regulation is best assessed by a blood test for fasting blood glucose and fasting insulin. If you go to the doctor to get these tested, they will almost always only order fasting blood glucose, but you need both fasting glucose and fasting insulin to be able to accurately assess what's going on in that relationship. So often I'll see a fasting insulin that is higher than we want it to be, but glucose is normal. And if we don't take both of those tests, we'll miss it and assume that everything's okay. Now, this is just one snapshot in time, that one point in the morning, looking at your glucose and your insulin. It doesn't tell us what's happening throughout the day, and our blood sugar and insulin constantly goes up and down as we eat throughout the day. So we do have to take that with a grain of salt in terms of what's happening overall. And we can use signs and symptoms, some of the ones I listed before, in terms of assessing throughout the day whether glucose regulation is involved in your fatigue. That brings us to the 6th common cause for fatigue in new mums, and that is nutrient depletion. This is a massive one that I see in the new mums I work with. Energy production pathways are completely reliant on nutrients as either the substrate, so the actual building blocks that go through the energy production pathways to create the cellular energy, or they're needed as cofactors for enzymes that power these pathways along. When we're deficient in any of the essential nutrients needed for these pathways, they just can't function at their best and our energy will suffer. Nutrient depletion is common in the first year after birth because of the demands of pregnancy, the nutritional demands of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, particularly if you're breastfeeding. Your nutritional needs increase when you're a breastfeeding mum above what they were in pregnancy, and not many mums are aware of that. Not to mention the demands of caring for a new baby and being sleep deprived, on top of having less time and energy to actually nourish yourself. This is why it's so common. In a lot of cases, it often takes supplementation for specific nutrients to get stores up to where you want them to be, while in the meantime, we work on building a strong foundation of those nutrient-dense foods to be able to maintain nutrient stores down the track. Some of the most important nutrients for energy production pathways include the B vitamins, and that's a big group, a number of vitamins there, magnesium, copper, iron, and vitamin C. Number 7 is gut dysfunction. Our digestive system is the epicenter of where our food transforms into the nutrients that we need for energy. Without a well-functioning digestive system to actually break down the food that we consume, not to mention absorbing the nutrients from that food into the bloodstream, we are more prone to nutrient deficiencies like the ones we just discussed before. So here we're thinking about how are we chewing our food, breaking it down initially in the stomach, digesting it with enzymes in the small intestines, and then absorbing all that nutrition across the lining of the digestive system and into the blood. There's lots of steps there that need to go right for us to get the nutrition from the food we need. And many digestive imbalances or dysfunctions can contribute to one or all of these steps being impaired and preventing us from getting that nutrition. On top of this, some specific conditions in the gut can contribute to fatigue as well. Things like intestinal permeability, which is sometimes called leaky gut, that in itself can contribute to fatigue beyond the actual digestion and absorption of nutrients, as can food allergies and intolerances, things like celiac disease, constipation, as well as dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of our microbiome ecosystem in the large bowel. The 8th and final common cause that I see involved in fatigue in new mums is mental health and mood challenges. Our mood is intricately connected to our sense of vitality and well-being, and fatigue is a common experience for those mums who are struggling with mental health challenges, including those that might not fall into a classic diagnosis like maternal overwhelm or maternal anger or maternal irritability. All really common experiences for mums, but they might not necessarily fit neatly into a diagnosis of, say, postpartum depression. I see the connection between mental health and energy or fatigue as being multifaceted or bidirectional. In some cases, the underlying physiology that may be contributing to the mental health condition or your mood can also be responsible for contributing to the fatigue. So they're driven by the same underlying biochemical processes. For example, if neuroinflammation is a factor, which we now understand is involved for lots of mental health conditions, then chances are that there's probably inflammation in other parts of the body contributing to fatigue. Or if you have any gut imbalances, as we just discussed, they can be contributing to fatigue as well. And there is a big connection between the gut and the brain. But it can go the other way too. When we're experiencing these challenges with our mood, it can cause a sense of flatness, both mentally and physically. So that's it. Those are the 8 most common reasons that I see contributing to fatigue in the mums that I work with. Don't take sleep deprivation as the only cause of your fatigue. It might be contributing a lot, but there are certainly other factors that I see all the time, and it's important not to overlook them. If you'd like to feel more energized and explore some of these reasons, I work with mothers one-on-one to help with this exact thing. I take a holistic look at all of these different body systems and all the factors at play. We look at food and nutrition, we look at lifestyle factors, we look at your sleep, we look at your stress, and we form an understanding of what things might be at play and how we can step by step get on top of these things so that you can feel as energized as possible and continue to be responding to your baby in the way that you want to. We can run some blood tests, or you can talk to your doctor about having some preliminary blood tests done to start looking at some of these factors. And then with all that information, we make a plan that is tailor-made for you. You can check out my Instagram where I talk about these kind of topics all the time, as well as find me over on my blog, on my website, where I'm constantly writing articles on these kind of topics. That's all from me today. I hope that this was helpful for you in some way, and I will see you in the next video.